Here we go. So the title of my talk is The Basics and Beyond: Measuring, Assessment, and Treatment for Feeding in Issues with, treating feeding issues with children. And so I have two hats here. I have my Heartland feeding hat on, and I also have my Department of Education hat on, which comes on a couple of slides that I think is useful too. Okay, so what we're going to be covering here is just the basics and a little bit more beyond that. This is not your way that you're going to learn how to do this. You're not going to be Kathleen Piazza by the time we're done this particular project or this particular hour. Please understand that it takes years to develop these skills. We have a similar project here at the state of Iowa in which we're teaching people how to do FBAs, and it's taken us a little over 2 years per person to train, and they need at least 35 exemplars before they can demonstrate advanced level skills to be able to train others to do this. So I imagine feeding is a very similar path for folks as well. So please understand that if this is pretty heavy duty, it can be over your head or there's a lot to it. There is a lot to this, and there's a lot of literature out there that can take us in a different group of directions with this. So what I'm going to talk about today are three main points, these are there are many points that we can talk about, but these are the three main ones that I'm going to get into. One is really selecting the right feeding measures. What is important when we're dealing with feeding? Next, we're going to talk about how we do assessment and treatment, specifically how I do it, since that's the model that I utilize. We'll cover a whole bunch of other pieces that are under that bullet as well. And then we're going to talk about appropriate timeframes to evaluate treatment. That's not really all that difficult, but we'll get into that as well. It really comes down to the Kenny Rogers theme song there from the Geico commercials. You know, when do you hold them? When do you fold them? When do you walk away? And when do you run? And so we'll get into that towards the end of it. If we lose time, it'll probably be in that area. So I really want to focus on the middle bullet the most, which is what most people are most interested in. I am briefly going to touch on prevalence of issues here. Again, very quickly going through this for saving time for the more meatier stuff here. Feeding issues occur across a wide range of kids. Typically, developing kids have feeding issues. When we get to developmental disabilities, those numbers go up, with specific disability categories having very high levels of feeding issues, particularly kids that are survivors from NICU units, autism spectrum disorders, and kids with physical disabilities. I presented these data in Albuquerque in January, and these are some compelling data here. So when we're talking about all of the issues of feeding in the particular state of New Mexico, we're talking about a very large number. In Albuquerque alone, there would be 1,700 kids that could benefit from this particular program. And if I were to move my service right now to Albuquerque, I would barely be able to keep up. I wouldn't be able to keep up with the new referrals that would be coming on a day-by-day basis with this. So this is a major area in which there's very few people kind of addressing this within your state, particularly on the behavior analytics side of this. Now, I just recently came back from the APBA, and Kathleen Piazza did a presentation on feeding issues and showed what percentage of people are actually treating this. And we are outnumbered 7 to 1 by people who are practicing this. And I think that number is fairly conservative. I think that number is much higher than that, in that there's a lot of speech and language and occupational therapists that are way ahead of us as far as cornering the market and treatment, but not necessarily on the successes that we seem to enjoy within the literature of applied behavior analysis with this particular domain. So we do have a lot of work to do, which is, again, one of the reasons why I like doing these kinds of talks. Okay, when we talk about feeding issues, they really fall into two main categories, and it really isn't much more than just demographically identifying these. It doesn't change the treatment outcomes for these kids. It slightly changes the way we approach it, but not too much. And the two types are total food refusal and food selectivity. With total food refusal, this is what we call our equal opportunity refuser. They pretty much refuse everything. They're usually carrying a diagnosis of failure to thrive, which is the worst of the outcomes that we usually can see with this particular issue, meaning that the child isn't growing appropriately, and then that has an effect on brain development. These particular kids are normally developing typically when we look at them, except when we put them with their same age peers. Then we see the differences, and they're very dramatic across a global range of skills, that they are further behind than kids their typical chronological age. Now, food selectivity, it's a little bit of a different monster. In this particular case, we have the child that will consume only specific food items and food types. So we might have children that will eat fruits and starches but won't touch proteins or vegetables. Or we may have some kids that are extremely selective, in which they're eating only a few items, like they're on a chicken nugget diet or a macaroni and cheese only diet. And that's pretty much all they're eating, maybe 3 or 4 additional foods on a semi-regular basis. But their items are very restricted as far as breadth of vitamins and minerals, but calorie-wise, these kids are probably okay, because the foods that they typically are eating are very high in calorie and low in nutrition. We will see food selectivity across a range of different things, not just necessarily food types, but we'll see it as far as textures. We'll see it in colors, smell, temperature, brand. We'll see it in a lot of different idiosyncrasies that go across this, which makes for a somewhat complicated approach to this, right? Well, the answer is no. It really doesn't matter what the selectivity is about. They are all treatable. In food selectivity, we have a 100% success rate with addressing this particular issue, as opposed to the kids with total food refusal, which is a little bit lower in our experience, but that's still a 94% success rate, at least in the programs that I trained in. In the big 5 programs around the country, it's about 90%, so it's still pretty darn good. Usually when we deal with food selectivity, and this is where most BCBAs are really running into these types of kids, these are kids on the autism spectrum, because BCBAs get to work with kids with autism, right? That's where we're compacted to work with those kids. So these are the kids that you're more likely to run into. Now, it doesn't mean that there are kids with autism that don't have failure to thrive. There are. I've treated them. And there are certainly kids that are food selective that don't have autism. And again, I've treated them. So this isn't exclusively for that. It's just where the ratios tend to be. I would say of my food selective kids, 85% of them are on the spectrum. Now, so that's just kind of the quick demographics of this. Now I'm going to jump into, again, the issues that we're going to cover. So I'm going to talk about the important feeding issues right now, selecting the right goals, and then yoking our data collection to those goals. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, here's my Department of Ed hat again. And so the first thing I really want to point out here is that the federal government has really defined what we're supposed to do in early intervention when we work with these kids. And this also extrapolates to Part B or special education funding as well. But this goes all the way down to the early intervention kids from 3 to 5, or frankly, birth to 5, when we're talking about this particular area. So the thing I want to point out here is that the content of the plan says that, and the IFSP is the Individualized Family Service Plan, and it shall be in writing, and it shall contain a statement of the infant or toddler's present levels of adaptive development based off of objective criteria. Now, I want to unpack 2 of these phrases here. Adaptive development. Feeding is an adaptive behavior skill, so it falls in line with an IEP goal. So oftentimes we will see that schools will avoid this particular issue because they say it's medical. And frankly, that's just not true. If the medical folks have ruled out all medical reasons, then it's a behavior issue, and then it's an adaptive behavior issue, and therefore amenable on an IEP for treatment. So this opens up treatment for a wide range of kids, not just our kids with autism as BCBAs. So I think that's important. The second aspect of this, which is important, is that we have to base our present levels of performance on objective criteria. And this is where I find that a lot of people that don't take a behavioral approach to this do not use objective criteria for evaluating their effectiveness on feeding issues. So keep that in mind as we go through the rest of these. Now, there's 6 main points in this law, and I'm going to highlight just the 4 that stand out the most. The second one is on point 3. It says a statement of measurable results or outcomes expected to be achieved for the infant, toddler, and the family, and the criteria, procedures, and timelines used to determine the progress towards blah, 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 right? So the idea here is that we're supposed to be able to measure these results and outcomes for these kids, and it's supposed to have very objective measures to these based off of the previous one. Now, the criteria and the timelines means that we don't have unlimited amount of time to work with these kids. And if I had more time, I'd share with you why that's critical to address these things. So the outcomes for these kids can be really bad if we don't treat these kids in a timely manner. So I think it's important for us to understand, back to that Kenny Rogers thing, when are we going to keep with what we're doing? When are we going to change what we're doing? When are we going to increase our dosage? When are we going to refer to a different group of people? So that's what this particular piece comes in mind. What this tells us is that we cannot in perpetuity have failed treatments for these kids. We need to be able to send them to people that can have success with them. The next one, and this one's my favorite, is a statement of early intervention services based off of peer-reviewed research. This is huge. As my Department of Education hat is on here, that we are bound by using evidence-based practice. Any approach that people use that isn't a behavior analytical in nature doesn't have a very strong research base to it. So what this tells me is that it puts us first in line for being able to treat these kids. Now, the problem with that is, even though the peer-reviewed research says that that's the case, is this within your scope of practice as a BCBA? And that's really where I think there's some problems with that. So without a lack of good people able to implement feeding treatments and assessments for kids in schools, we're really out into the open of anybody doing anything that they want. But if you have some good training in this area, you pretty much get to move to the front of the line as far as being able to do your treatments. The last of these things here has to do with the projected dates for the initiation of the services, the anticipated length, duration, and frequency of those services. And this all gets at dosage. How much time do you really get? In early intervention, they may let you see the kid twice a week if you're lucky. And so if it fails there, there's no reason why you can't go to once a week, once a day, or 2 times a day, or 4 times a day, or every meal of every day, if that's what's necessary. So as long as you have database decisions and you're using criteria to evaluate when you're going to move to those decisions, I think you're in good solid ground here for being able to do that. And if you're at your maximum level of intensity and you're still not having success, then that's the point in time where you need to be able to refer them to people who can address this particular issue, rather than continually trying and failing. It is way inappropriate for people to work with a kid for 18 months and not make progress. I think that exposes folks to liability. Okay, so I wanted to set up the framework for what the federal government says as far as what we're supposed to do when we address this particular issue. And there are a couple of court cases out there that have challenged these issues, and they've all sided with the schools have to do this. So I think this opens up BCBAs for more than just working with kids with autism. So that's why I think that's important. Okay, so how do I address this? How do I use these pieces of information in my practice and the work that I do? And as I talk about these things, I want you guys to steal as much of this as you can with the ways that you address these issues. So please feel free to do that. Now, the first thing I do is I have a screening packet. You can go to my website, you can download that. It's not a problem to find. It says on there, download a screening packet. And there's a lot of questions on there that it asks. It's a lot of legalese. It's a lot of things that are somewhat important for CYA purposes. But there are some major ones that I really want to point out, major questions that are addressed in the screening tool that I want to find out. So when a parent, I'm sorry, I got a chat question here. Okay, great. Okay. So when it first comes down, the first thing I really want to find out from the parents is how important is feeding an issue for the caregivers. And this has a lot to do. With how much work that the parents are willing to do to fix the issue. So if the parents rate it on a scale of 1 to 10 as a 2 or a 3 or a 5, then I have to give them a cure, for lack of a better term, that's going to be very low effort, or they're probably not going to do it. If the amount of effort it is for them to do the intervention is more than what they have to deal with the problem, they're very unlikely to do it. And so I tend to avoid those types of cases. I usually take cases in which they identify it as an 8 or a 9 or even a 10. And I've seen parents even go up to an 11 and up to a 20 because it's so important. And it's really easy to work with those ones. I want to find out what they've done in the past. Who did they work with? What did they do? How long did they go? I want to talk with those people to see, did they attend? Was it a treatment integrity failure? Was it that it just failed? It didn't work for that kid? I want to hear both the parent side as well as the provider side as to why that didn't necessarily work. What is the child consuming? I have a 3-day food record log in which I have the families fill out what the child has been offered and what they have eaten. And then I send that through my nutritionist to do an evaluation of that content for calories, minerals, and vitamins as well. What are we dealing with? Food refusal, total food refusal, or are we dealing with food selectivity? And I definitely want to get consent to talk to anybody and everybody that I want to. Mainly, I'm interested in talking with their physician because the most important thing from a CYA standpoint is I want medical clearance. We have no business addressing feeding issues unless we have medical clearance. So if a child can't safely swallow, then we really shouldn't be able to work with them, because we have a powerful technology to get kids to take bites of food. But if that's going to cause them to choke, or we're going to have to use our infant and child CPR, it's probably not a good idea and probably going to get into some trouble for that. So I want to make sure that we have a green light to proceed. So I want that kind of clearance from the physicians. The parents will always say, oh yeah, he's fine, but I want to hear it from the physicians. And so I like to get it in writing when I can. And if I can't get it in writing, I at least want them to leave me a voicemail saying it's okay, just so I have that in case something ever goes wrong. Nothing has ever gone wrong, but the day that you don't do it is the day you'll run into problems with that. I've already mentioned the nutrition, but I also want to talk a little bit about the parents. I want to know what the parents expect for their kids when we do this work. And so when I ask parents, I never get the answers that I'm looking for. I get answers like, I want my child to love eating food. And, you know, I tell them I can't deliver on that. And I have a really good example of how my parents gave me $5 to take out the garbage on Mondays, but I never and ever have gained a love for taking out the garbage. Now, I still do due to negative reinforcement. I don't want maggots or a smelly garage, so I don't need $5 anymore to be able to take out my garbage. I'd like $5, it ain't coming, but I certainly have other reinforcers that make me do that. And likewise, we'd expect the same for the kid. I'll let them judge whether their children love eating broccoli or not, but even if they don't love eating broccoli, most kids don't like eating broccoli, and most kids still have to eat broccoli. And so that's just the way it is. So I can't get your kid to love eating food, but I can get them to eat food. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. And so when we talk with the parents, when they come up with their goals, I have to come up with my goals. And then I really want to make sure that the goals that I come up with, the parents are going to agree to. So if the parent's kid is eating 4 bites of food on a daily, every meal basis, and then I tell the parents that, well, we're going to get your child to eat 35 to 40 bites per meal. Is that okay? And they're like, yeah, I'll sign me up. I'm all for that. We're going to reduce all the crying and tantruming down to low levels. Are you okay with that? Oh yeah, I'm down with that too. So the issues here that we're looking for here is that when I come up with my goals, will the parents agree with them? And if they don't, this is a time where we should break bread. And so you go this way and we'll go this way. And if you want to come back, we can, because these are the things I can address. And that's important for when we finish treatment, when we think we've been successful, and the parents as well, you didn't get them to like it. And this is, we never meant to, but that's what the parents were thinking all along. So I think it's real important to make sure that we have that stuff done up front. So that's that. Okay, so define our measurables. So we're going back to the early intervention law, the federal law on that. And so we have to define what we're going to do when we deal with feeding issues. So the first of these things is weight. You know, we want to make sure that the kid is gaining weight. Now, when we're dealing with food selectivity, that usually isn't the issue, but when we're dealing with failure to thrive, it usually is an issue. And so we want to measure weight. We also want to measure calories and the nutritional needs. So if we're dealing with weight issues, calories are going to be a big deal. If weight isn't the issue, then nutritional needs are probably the issue. Is this child anemic? Are they getting enough iron? Are they getting enough calcium? Are they getting enough folate? Whatever their deficiencies are, we want to make sure that our treatment is addressing those particular issues. Otherwise, we haven't really done anything for that particular child. The last of these things that are of high importance from a measurable standpoint is whether we're going to get how many bites of food in. So when we're dealing with total food refusal, bites are going to be important. How many bites that they eat. And it doesn't matter what the food item is, whether it's chocolate cake, chocolate pudding, broccoli, French fries, or whatever. The more food that they eat, the more calories they're going to get. The more calories they get, the greater the weight gain. So we don't care how the calories are gotten, as long as we can prevent that child from being on a feeding tube, we've accomplished our goals in that particular example. Now, when we're dealing with food selectivity, we're not really interested in the foods that they're already eating. So if we have a child that's eating their fruits and their starches, we really don't care about how many fruits and starches they're eating. We're more interested in how many proteins and vegetables that they're eating during meals. And so we'll measure those particular items for our progress monitoring, because we can have a child that will eat 50 bites of starches, but 0 proteins and vegetables. And that's really what our goal is. So we got to make sure we define what we're looking for. And so when I deal with food selectivity with families, I usually have them come up with a list of food items that we want to target that will meet whatever the nutritional needs that they are. And then I'll cross-reference their list with our nutritionist to make sure that we're hitting all the issues. So for example, parents put some fruits down, and the dietitian says, well, they're really low on potassium, so let's swap out the apple with banana, which has more potassium in it. And so we'll make small substitutions according to the nutritionist to meet the needs for the kid. Okay, so they're the main measures. So how are we going to measure this? So when we do weight gain, we don't measure kids every day. That's ridiculous. So on a typical way that we do measuring weight for kids is on a bi-weekly basis. So when I do this, generally speaking, my treatment plans go about 2 weeks long before we've achieved our goals. So I really try to get the weight gain before we start our process, and then at the end of treatment. And then I'll do it at whatever our follow-ups are. And I typically do follow-ups 2 weeks later, a month later, and 3 months later, give or take flight schedules and stuff like that. But that's typically what we'll do with that. Now, I will have historical data on weight too, so I can always keep that in line. But I really want to know, just before I started treatment, what did this kid weigh, and then what did they do right when we finished, so we can see if there's been any change. And rarely do we see major dramatic changes in this because it's such a lagging measure of success. Where we do see it is in follow-ups. That's usually where we see our success. And then we can compare it to the trajectories that we saw prior to that. So the kid was flatlining in their weight, and now they're growing at a very high clip. That shows up really well on a child growth chart. Same thing with the calories and nutritional status. We can measure calories on a daily basis. So at the end of a meal, we don't necessarily care how many calories per meal they get, as long as they get enough calories met by the end of the day. So if a child has 1,200 calorie needs and they do 4 meals a day, that's 300 calories a meal, right? So if a kid gets 250, that's not necessarily a failure if most of the foods that they had in that particular meal were low calorie. And then the next meal afterwards had some higher calorie, caloric density foods. And even though they had the same number of bites, so let's say they had 35 bites in both meals, but that meal had 400 calories in it, between the two of them, we're ahead of the game at this point. So by the end of the day, we'll still be on pace for meeting this child's caloric goals. So we can measure that, and I do. I usually have graphs on a day-by-day basis of how many calories the child had consumed, and then I show the growth in that as well. Now, the more very close data that we have, the data that we have the most control over and that we can see on a day-by-day, or on a meal-by-meal basis, is how many bites that they accepted in a meal. And that's it's as simple as taking a data sheet and logging it down as we go along. I have a couple different data sheets that I use. I thought about putting them in here, but I just don't have the time to really describe them. But this is not that difficult. We'll talk about how to define those in the next couple of slides. So there's lots of different ways that you can measure that. Now, there are 2 other measures that I'm interested in looking at that are of some importance, but by themselves, they're not meaningful. So those 2 behaviors are refusal behaviors and problem behaviors. We do want to reduce refusal behaviors, and refusal behaviors can be really the big issue that we have to treat for these kids. And so measuring that is important. But we can reduce refusals as long as the kid doesn't take bites. Then we really haven't accomplished anything, because if they don't take bites and they don't get calories, they're not going to get weight. And so, or they're not going to get their nutritional needs met. So refusals by themselves, if we reduce refusals and we haven't done anything on the other 3 measures, we really haven't done anything. Same thing with the problematic behaviors. Problematic behaviors, we can decrease the crying and the whining and the tantruming and even other kinds of problematic behaviors like food throwing and stuff like that. But, and we'll even have the parents will say, says, if you can get my kid to eat, I can deal with that. Well, you see that kid still doing that 3 meals later, and those parents are not going to be implementing your treatment procedures for very long. So we do need to address that issue. But by itself, again, it is not a goal. Just because we've decreased problematic behavior and the bites have not gone up, we haven't done anything for that child nutritionally, or at least on the feeding side of things. We've reduced problematic behaviors associated with food, but we haven't gotten them to eat the food, and that's really what we're tasked to do. So I do measure these behaviors as well. And I do set goals according to these things as well. But the main goal is always going to be, for me, or for the work that we do, is the number of bites that they consume. That's our main benchmark for measuring our success. So when we set our goals, we're going to come up with what our baseline data tells us. And we're going to talk about that in the next section. And just to kind of go through this really quickly here, is that our baseline data can tell us exactly what's going on with the kid. So if the child's eating 1.1 bites per meal, that ain't good enough. They're never going to get enough calories in. They're never going to gain weight. They're going to lose weight on that. And so we need to establish a goal that's going to be appropriate. And our nutritionist helps with that. And so if the child's eating 35 to 40 bites per meal, they're probably going to meet that goal under those circumstances. Again, we want to reduce refusals. We want to reduce problematic behavior. And so there we are, some example goals of what we would establish for a particular child. So that covers that part of things here. So what I want to get into now is the approach that I take to gather the information. So now we know how we're going to measure it when I go into the family's home and we're going to work with them. But how does it all play out? So let me show you how I do it. There's 3 basic phases that I utilize, and this comes right from the Joe Lally Bud Mace descriptive analysis model from this. So I'm actually using the stuff that I learned back in the 1990s with my feeding approach to this. So when I do baseline, I want to watch parents doing the meals as they would normally do, with me saying nothing, doing nothing. I'm just a fly on the wall. I'm a leaf in the wind. You just do what you normally do. I'm staying out of your hair. Just show me what you do. Invariably, there's still reactivity even when I'm there. So I absolutely have been shaped to not say a word. Parents are always asking me, what are you writing down? Are you judging me? No, I'm not. I promise you, I'll show you everything. If you want, I'll lock up my notes in a safe in your house so that you know that I didn't manipulate these for you. I'm here to help you. I'm not here to judge you. And so I really need to see some information, which I'll show you in another slide, why I need that. But when I tell parents what's going on there, they automatically change their behavior. As an example, there was parents that fed their kid in a swing. And so I'd asked them if they had ever used a high chair before, and they looked at, oh yeah. And then the next meal I came, there was a brand new high chair. The tag was still on it. So there was no way they were doing that, but simply because I said that, they went and thought that they needed to do that, or they were doing something wrong. And so it's not what I want. I need to see what they're normally doing so that I can make changes accordingly. Then when I go to treatment, which is the longest part of the process, this is where I'm going to do the things that I'm going to do. I'm going to systematically manipulate the things that they're doing from a least to most intrusive level. So when I do my baseline, I always see parents doing some things that are right. They might not be on the schedule of reinforcement I would like, and so I might manipulate that schedule. I'm also interested in what the parents are doing that hinders their eating. So when I see things that are unsafe, like the parents don't cut up the hot dog into smaller pieces so it can cause a choking hazard, I'll jump in under those circumstances. But for the most part, when I see parents doing stuff that doesn't work, yelling at your kid isn't seemingly working very much. So maybe we want to discontinue that. And then I want to add in some things that the parents aren't using that I know are part of the repertoire that can fix this particular scenario for this particular child. So what are we going to do that we keep that's right and embellish that? What are they doing that's wrong that we want to kind of put on extinction? And what are the things that I can add in that might help, like an NCR schedule or a DRA or something else that the parents haven't been implementing and do that. And then ultimately within this, I want to make sure consistency is being implemented. That's the thing that I want to instill, that we're going to follow a protocol from start to finish. And we're going to let the data dictate whether it's working or not. Because a lot of the parents that I'll work with will change mid-meal, within meals, as well as cross meals as far as their strategies and tactics. So we want them to kind of stay on something consistent and evaluate it from there. So that's also something that I work on with them. Once we have a successful treatment plan, then we're going to talk about caregiver training and fading and generalization. And so we want the parents to work without a net. We want them to be able to do this without me being there. I don't know how many times I've been named the godfather of the kid because I've been able to do stuff that everybody else hasn't been able to do. And the parents want me to move in with them, and I'm Uncle Charlie now. And that's just not how this is supposed to work. I want to get in, disrupt their lives, and get out with their kid eating without me having to be there. And that's really what my goal is. So when we establish our goals, what did we see in our baseline? Okay, in the 8 meals that I watched at baseline, I saw the child ate 1.1 bite per meal. Or if it's a food selective kid, the child ate 1 meat and 0 vegetables, plenty of starches, plenty of fruits. We're not going to target those. And then I'm going to establish the goals from that. Now, again, the nutritionist will help me with this, but particularly for these particular two different exemplars, 35 to 40 bites per meal would meet the caloric needs for that child if they did 4 meals a day. And for the kid who's not eating enough meat and vegetables, mom and dad, are you happy with 9 to 10 bites of meats and vegetables per meal, which equates to about 1 or 2 servings per meal for each of those kids, which is going to meet our RDA recommendations for that kid. And if anything, it's going to over meet those, and then no pun intended there, and then we'll fade once we have success achieved. Now, in our baseline evaluations, and if I want to go slow over this slide, because this is probably my most important slide, demonstrating what I do. So I know I'm talking fast because I want to get all this content in, so I apologize if I'm going way too fast. Within this is one I want to really slow down. So this is how I do it. So when I go into baseline, I watch meals in real time, as I said. And the first thing I want to see is this an issue of lack of opportunity. The parents never even bring the kid to the table. They've given up. You know, they're no longer even trying to do this anymore. Or is it just simply an issue of abuse? And so we've seen that, and it's a very simple test. If we put food in front of the kid and they eat ravenously, that isn't boding well for the parents. Now, it's not a one trial opportunity either, but when we do it multiple times and the kid is eating really well, that doesn't go well for parents. Now, the good news is that's rare. They're usually equal opportunity refusers and will refuse for us just as well as they'll refuse for others. So we identify a legitimate feeding disorder. So we literally can exonerate these families by doing so. And we have a case right here in Des Moines where this has actually happened, and the child has passed away. And so nobody ever did this test, and so the parent's defense is probably going to be a solid one. But I digress. Let me move back to the presentation. So I'm interested in the kids' behaviors, right? And so this is going to match up or graph very nicely over what we've already talked about as far as behavioral definitions. I'm interested in the bites that the child has accepted. How many bites is the child accepting? Are they independently feeding themselves? What does the food refusal look like? Are they turning their head when bites are offered? Or are they letting the food come into their mouth and then expelling it or throwing it up? Are they packing the food where they're putting it into the corners of the mouth and chipmunking it so the parents won't put more food into their mouth because they already have food in there? So what does the food refusal look like? Because there's different tactics and strategies that we would use for each of those types of food refusal. What does the problematic behavior look like? Are we dealing with this whiny behavior? Or are we dealing with full-blown tantrums and the kids running away from the table or flipping the table? What are we dealing with here? And these are the things that we're going to set for our goals for the kid. You know, bites accepted, food refusal, and problem behavior. It's exactly what we talked about in the previous slides. And so this is important from a dependent measure. This is what we're going to evaluate. These measures here are going to evaluate the effectiveness of any intervention components that we bring to bear on this particular problem. So let's take a look at what we're looking at on the other side of this, right? So I'm also interested in the caregiver behaviors. So when I'm doing my baseline evaluation, I'm paying attention to that as well. So I'm interested in the antecedents and the consequences that follow those child behaviors: bite acceptance, food refusal, and problem behavior. So how are bites presented on the antecedent side? Are they fast and then they slow down? Oh my gosh, Sally's eating. Let's get in as many bites as we can while the green light is on. And so they're offering Sally 6 to 8 bites in a minute, which is way too much for her to handle. And then she starts to refuse. And so what is that teaching her, right? Refuse. Because they're going to, every time I open my mouth, I keep shoveling food into it. So it doesn't pay off to do so. They don't give me enough time to chew and swallow the food. They keep on forking it in like a shoveler. How large are the bites? Can the child handle the food item? Yeah, I've seen that child be able to handle a big bite before, but it took them 5 minutes to chew it. And so if it takes them 5 minutes to chew that, let's think about that. In 20 minutes, the child has eaten 4 bites of food. They're never going to meet their caloric needs that way. We need to address that issue, and it's also unsafe. How long are the meals? Do they bring the kid to the table? Are you ready to eat? Meal's over. All right, okay, we're done. Well, that ain't good. They're never going to get enough calories in that way if they come to the table and they sit there for 15 seconds to 2 minutes. Or is it one of those scenarios where the parent slaved over a hot stove and that kid's not getting up until they eat that particular food, and they're there for an hour and a half long? And when I look at the minute-by-minute analysis of that, they got 3 bites of food in the first 10 minutes and 2 bites in the remaining hour and 25 minutes they sat there. And that's certainly not going to get them to the promised land as far as getting them where they need to go. So sitting longer isn't necessarily doing it better. What do they do when a bite is accepted? Do they let sleeping dogs lie? Oh my God, she took a bite, shut up. And then, you know, dad makes a yeah, you're a good kid. And then she stops eating and then it's dad's fault. Dad's the bad guy here. Or is it that they're really good and exuberant when a bite is accepted? What do they do when bite acceptance occurs on the consequence side? What do they do when a refusal occurs? Do they back off? Do they persist with the food item? You're not getting out of this. Nothing makes me cringe more than when I hear a metal spoon clanking against the kid's teeth. That's always awful and hard to watch, and hard to hear. And so I'll jump in those cases as well. What do they do? They change the food items. Okay, you don't want the broccoli. Here you go. Here's your Dorito instead. And so again, what do they do when the refusal occurs? Do they give them something that's more preferred? And do the meals end when they engage in a refusal behavior? I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a couple more sub-bullets. Do they bargain with the kids? If you eat these 2 bites of peas, we're going to go to Disneyland. And then do they even follow through on that? And even if they did follow through on that, the response reinforced a relationship there is too far gone for them to get that the idea that they got to Disneyland the next day, if they got on the plane right after the meal, is contiguous to strengthen that the response of eating peas gets me to Disneyland. Do they threaten the kids? If you don't eat this, grandma's not coming over for your birthday, you're not going to get any Christmas gifts. Again, there's no way they're going to follow through on that, and kids figure it out pretty quickly. And so the last thing I'm interested in here of all the ones here, and this is not exhaustive, by the way, is how do meals end? I always think that's always interesting, because how do meals end? From a negative reinforcement standpoint, this is an aversive situation for the kid. And so when meals end, what was the behavior that led to that? Now, a lot of parents will say the kids can get down when they finish the last bite of food on their plate. But that's not what I see. I often see that the majority, if not 100% of the meals, end on food refusal or problematic behavior. So what's the response reinforcer relationship there? And so that's important, and that leads me to other treatment outcomes, because we need to eliminate that response reinforcer relationship for us to have some success. Okay, and so again, what's really important for this is that this is important for treatment development. So all over here on the left-hand side, these are my dependent variables, and over here are all my independent variables. These are the things that I'm going to change to see how much they've affected the target behaviors over here. And so that's what I'm looking for. So the antecedents and the consequences, 2/3 of this equation is all about changing caregiver behaviors to see their impact on the child behaviors. So people tend to think, and most of the other pedagogies are, we're going to fix the child, we're going to fix the caregivers, and that's what results in the results, and that's what results in the results that we get. So when we do our baseline data collection, how do I collect my data? I do frequency counts of the target bites accepted or the bites accepted, depending on which the goal is. For food refusal and problematic behavior, for me, I don't keep track of those on an individual basis. If you have the ability to do that, go ahead, do so. Every time the kid shakes his head, is that 1 refusal or is that 15 refusals that we just saw? For me, it's just a lot easier. If there was a bite that was offered and they turned their head just once and then accepted that bite, that's a refusal. They engaged in a food refusal. They also accepted the food item too. So I've got both of those scored, so they're not mutually exclusive. A child can initially refuse food and then accept it, and so I can keep track of that. So for food refusal, I'm looking at the number of bites that were offered that were associated with refusals divided by the number of bites that were offered, and that gives me the percentage of food refusal that occurred in that meal. And I use a very similar format for evaluating whether problematic behavior was associated with a bite offer. And so that's what I'll track, and you'll see some of this in my graphs, and hopefully that'll make some sense as you see it. Okay, for calories, we simply do a simple count for the end of, at the end of each meal, and then we add it up for the day. I could care less about how many calories per meal there are. It's the end of the day data that's all important. For some people, they like to count the volume of the food as well, and so that does come in handy at times. And that just requires weighing pre and post food, the amount of food that was offered. It can get very time consuming, but it is a very accurate, more accurate way than simply eyeballing it and seeing how much the child ate. Again, the weight we talked about, if we do it every other week, I've had parents even go right to their pediatrician to use the official scale at there, and they'll do that as well. But generally speaking, if we're going to measure that, and I don't measure it too often, because we're in and out in about 2 weeks. Our average treatment length is 19 days. So really all we get is a baseline and a post-treatment one during that time. So it really doesn't come up as a major issue. But if you're going, my point of having this point in this slide is that we don't need to weigh a child after every meal or after every day or every other day. It really is futile to do so. it's a lagging measure of success. Okay, how long do we set the meal length? This is where I get my nutritionist involved. I'm going to skip a little of this for time. I think I'm a little bit behind in my time, so I'll just leave it at that. Is that the nutritionists really help us determine the meal length and the calories. It becomes a math equation. So if the child needs 1,200 calories and we do 4 meals a day, that's 300 calories per meal. 300 calories per meal. If the child is getting 8 calories per bite, then that means between 35 bites to 40 bites, we should be able to meet our goals. So it's really how that's equated to. And if it wasn't, then we would add another meal or we'd add more time to meals. So that's really where it comes down to. It becomes a big math puzzle for us. Okay, how long do we set the meals? I've already just talked about this. I'm going to skip through it so I can show you a case study within this. Okay. So Jonathan is the case study I want to talk about. He's 4 years old. He had PDD. He had reflux, which was treated by medication. He also had some allergies with peanuts and wheat, and we simply avoided those foods. He ate all of his starches and he ate a lot of snack foods, particularly goldfish and Doritos. He had lots of refusal behaviors that we talked about, but most of the refusal behaviors were antecedent-based, meaning he wouldn't take the bite. Once he did take the bite, he usually consumed it. He had 9 months of early intervention data in which he ate very few target bites. He refused a lot and licked a lot of food, but he never ate it. And so they did that for 9 months, and the treatment that they used was to prepare 4 plates of food in the hopes that he'd eat something from those. So that was what we saw from before I started. The goals that we set for him is we had the parents come up with a list of 10 items that made up proteins, vegetables, and fruits according to these criteria. And we wanted to present 2 of those bites of food in every meal, along with a starch and a snack food. And the goal being that he would eat 9 to 10 of each of these target foods, and that's what we were tracking. We had such good success so quickly, we decided to take away, add in another target food and reduce either a snack food or a starch. So during breakfast, lunch, and dinner, there was a starch. During snacks, it was a snack food. And then there was a protein, a vegetable, and a fruit at every meal. We wanted to decrease the refusal behaviors, we wanted to decrease the problematic behaviors, and we wanted to train a whole bunch of people. So for generalization purposes, it wasn't just mom and dad, it was his therapeutic support staff that came in and did in-home work with him in the evenings, and his school staff during the day that had to implement these procedures. So there's a wide variety of people we wanted to generalize these treatment procedures with. I have data for all the dependent measures. I only have time to talk about the bites. So when we initially implemented his treatment, the very first meal, he ate 23 bites of a target food, and mom's mouth bottomed out. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe this. You think I'm a big liar. I'm like, no, we'll try it again. And we tried it again in meal 2, and he didn't eat it. And then we tried the same items with dad in meals 3 and 4, and showed no progress there either. So mom, we believe you. He doesn't want to eat these foods. No sweat. So we implemented our initial treatment with our goal being 18 to 20 bites across 3 consecutive meals. And we met that goal in 5 days. And we our trend line was showing that it was going really, really well. So over 9 months of treatment in which they couldn't get him to do this, we had every meal in which he ate target food items. So when we looked at his original baseline, he basically once every 1 meal every other week, he would have a meal like we saw in data point number 1. Here, every meal, he was eating target food items. So then we increased the goal, like I said, to 3 target foods in the meal. And again, within 4 days, we met that goal again, in which he was eating 34, 32, and 31 bites of target food items across both parents. We then started to do training, and it didn't look so good when you first look at this, but this requires some explanation. So in this particular case, we were working mainly with mom, and dad did some meals. And when we did mom's meals, this is what we got. These are mom's meals here without me being present. So I was down at the Starbucks, set up a video camera, and then we watched the meals afterwards and did some critiquing of things within that. And so she got a high of 51 bites in during her treatment phase, meaning that he actually liked the food item. In fact, because there was a fixed number of bites, that meant he was asking for more after he completed it before the meal was over. So this guy had more than doubled or tripled his consumption of that particular food item. So that was pretty cool to see. And mom and dad certainly were happy that he was doing some new stuff too. This one here has to do with dad. So dad had a lower baseline. So he dropped, a lower initial meal of 18 bites during that. And it was mainly due to his pace. but he quickly got better as he went along. Then we did the therapeutic support staff, and then we did the school. And so we saw the lows come each time a new person did it. And the lowest of the lows that we had achieved at this was the first time the school had ever done it, because the parents pulled the kid from school to concentrate on this at home. And so this is the first time he went to school with them running the particular procedures. So our overall results here are here, but I really want to take a look at the pre-baseline data where refusals were 99% and the target bites were 0.3. And then at training at 4 days, when we were working with everybody, we were getting 30 target bites in, 6 refusals, and 4% problematic behaviors. This is extremely successful in a very short period of time. It took us, I think, what, 12 days? I think it was 12 days, 13 days, a little 13 days, 12 days and 2 meals, or 12 and 1/3 day. So that was a pretty quick case for us. Okay, so after we get the kid eating, that's not the end of the story. We don't just drop the mic and walk away. We really come up with doing other things for fading and generalization. So in his particular case, he really liked Bob the Builder, and Bob the Builder was the DRA that we were using for him. And so the idea there was that we're not going to give him Bob the Builder after every bite. We're going to give him Bob the Builder after every other bite, then after every 3rd bite, then after every 5th bite, then after every 10th bite, then at the twice a meal, and then at the end of meals like every other kid. And so that's really what we're looking for. So what we're looking for with fading is that we're trying to pull apart different components of the treatment plan so that this kid doesn't have to go to prom with these treatment procedures in place. Okay, so that's the gist of that right there. So now I want to get into the particular components of treatment within this. And so I really don't have enough time for this in 10 minutes, so I'll try my best to go through it. So there are 4 common treatment components in literature. So when I go and say, how am I going to apply these treatment procedures, they fall in a bunch of different procedures. There's augmentative procedures, there's basic procedures, moderate intrusive ones, and highly intrusive ones. And so here are the easy ones. These are some things that you can do today to help your kids now. Try to make sure that the bite pace is between 1.5 bites to 3 bites per minute. So don't ask the kids to eat 6 bites a minute. That's just not going to work. Generally speaking, sitting time for kids during meals is between 60 and 90 minutes cumulatively for the day. So for those parents that go too short or too long, which I talked about earlier, then we have to get the kids sitting there at least, even if they're not eating. And I've seen this happen simply by having the kids sit longer. There was nothing better to do, so they took more bites. Not necessarily clinically to clinically acceptable levels, but by itself, it actually had a doubling or a tripling effect of the bites that were consumed simply by having to sit there longer. For the parents that go too long, what do they do with that extra time? I don't know, get a life, read a book, go for a walk, enjoy the day. But what you were doing wasn't working. So let's make sure we're efficient in our time. I'm often criticized, appropriately and inappropriately, that I like to use timers in meals. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I always find interesting is how often do meals end after refusal behaviors? And when that's the case, this is my go-to recommendation. And the reason for why I go to this particular recommendation is that we want to take away that problematic behavior, refusal behaviors or problem behaviors in the meal. We want to come up with a new way that the meals end. And so when a timer goes off, that's non-contingent on anything that's going on with the kid. Not bite acceptance, not refusal. The meal is over when the timer goes off. And so kids pick up on this super quick. Within 2 or 3 meals, they get it. And so what that does is it weakens the response reinforcer relationship to their food refusal to end the meal, because it has nothing to do with when meals end. The meal ends when the timer goes off, so there's no motivation at this point to engage in refusal behaviors for ending the meal. There still may be the relationship where we're refusing the food so that they don't have to accept it in the meal, but it does nothing to do with ending the meal anymore, which is a big deal. So it's good for care providers, as I mentioned, that go too long or too short, and it's useful for the child that they now have a clear signal. Now, the common objections I run into this is that, okay, so Mr. Sean, so we're sitting here for 17 minutes, my kid didn't eat, now he starts eating, we got 6 bites in, and now the timer goes off and we're supposed to stop? Yup. He's still hungry. Yup. And he'll be that much hungrier in the next meal. Let's move on. And so parents always fight me on this, but it still helps. That kid becomes that much hungrier at the next meal, and they're more likely to take the bites of food that we offered in that particular time. So I'll move on from that as an example. But I use this more than 50% of the time with the cases that I work with, because I see that meal cessation almost always or dominantly ends on refusal behaviors, and this is a great strategy. Okay, other augmentative procedures. Make the meals more fun. I love to bring out the goofiness in the way that I interact with kids. Have fun. Meals sometimes are not fun for these kids, and simply the non-contingent aspects of having fun in meals can do it. Another one is that parents often try to trick their kids into eating. They use a lot of distraction. They'll give them toys to play with and then try to sneak in a bite into their mouth. But you got to be careful, because once you're outside that Fokker circle of trust, the kid's not going to eat anymore, and they're not going to trust you, and that's not something I can measure. But I've seen kids as young as 10 months old figure this out, and they just simply block better, and they don't take the toys from the families when they do that. So always provide prompts that a bite is coming. Let's be direct with the kid. Here comes a bite, and we're going to deal with the pain, or we're going to deal with whatever the consequences are. Take it or don't, or whatever procedure we have in place, we implement. Increasing the tastiness of the foods. This is a big deal. Parents sometimes go very granola or very low diet because we're overweight. We're the adults that we don't have calorie needs, we have calorie excesses, and so we're trying to be healthier in our food choices. But these kids need full fat everything. So calorie boosting and adding condiments increase the caloric density of these foods for these kids, and they make them more tastier. And so you can get some flavor conditioning there, that when you add syrup and butter to their pancakes, they're tastier, and now they're eating them when they wouldn't be before. We can also alter the bite presentations as well. So we can go down into doing simultaneous presentations, or we can actually shrink the size of the food to smaller and smaller levels until they're accepting it. There's a lot of different manipulations that are in the literature that you can look at that I don't have time to go through. One of my favorite ones is non-contingent reinforcement. I don't have a lot of time for this one, so I'll just kind of show it to you. I hope it pops up here, but this is an example of non-contingent reinforcement. So, is it working real well? Okay, all right, Dad, put on non-contingent reinforcement for me, will you? And so here he does. And now he accepts it just fine. Okay. I can show this video, it's about 2 minutes long, but Dad does a reversal here. He turns it off, he stops eating, and then he puts it back in place, and he starts eating again. So it's pretty clear with that. Okay, I think I'm out of time. Is that what I'm hearing? Yes, I sent the slides. I already sent the slides to Michael. Okay, moderately intrusive procedures. I'm pretty close to done. I got 2 slides left, so this ain't too bad. All right, moderately intrusive procedures. This is simply DRA, straight up DRA. So what Dennis is saying to Joey here, one good thing about vegetables, Joey, is they make dessert taste really good, right? Because that's your Pink Floyd treatment. How can you have your pudding if you haven't had your meat? And it's very classic here. It's very grandma's rule-ish here. But DRA doesn't have to be just a food piece, so contingent access to preferred food items. We've certainly done this, where we've had kids that won at McDonald's, and we gave them a bite of McDonald's for every time they took a bite of broccoli. And so then faded it. So they got McDonald's like every other week with that. But we can use contingent preferred activities, which we did in the example that I showed you. So he got Bob the Builder contingent on taking a bite of a target food. And we've also seen that attention was a big reinforcer, particularly in cases where there's some EO manipulations with parents, where mom and dad are further away from interacting with them because they're working, and those become more valuable reinforcers for the kid, or just flat out attention's just they love attention, and we can utilize that. Okay, so I got 2 slides left, and I got 4 minutes left, so I'm good. I think I got 2 minutes left. Okay, so how long should we go? I tell families when they're not going to seek me, if they're going to seek other treatments, go ahead and do that. But what I would tell you to do is, if you see no measurable progress on the stuff that we talked about, then you need to change what you're doing. Either they need to change their dosage, give you the full version of that, or you need to go see somebody else. That is treatment failure in my view. If after 6 months and they're still making progress, but the goals aren't achieved, that's not progress either. If the trend line says that they will gain all these skills 3 years and 6 months later, that's not good enough when we have the success that we can attain in a very short period of time. Like I said, for someone like myself or in some of the other programs, we typically do this in 2 to 3 weeks. My average length of admission is 19.1 days. That is way better than 6 months, way better than 3.5 years. So there are other approaches to addressing this. Not that you have that success, but when I do it, that's what I get. But it is also that I'm in the family's home for every meal of every day. So I'm there for breakfast, I'm there for lunch, I'm there for dinner, snacks in between, Saturday, Sunday, as well as Monday through Friday. So when I do this, I really get immersed with it. And so it takes us a very short period of time. Remember, the case Jonathan and I showed you, that was done in a matter of 13 days or 70 meals. So we can whip this problem quickly, and it's a little faster than what I typically get, but not so much. So I would say around 80 to 100 meals is usually the length of time that it takes. So he was a little quicker, but overall, the reason why it was so many days, where it was so short in days, is simply because we did 6 meals a day as opposed to 5 or 4 meals a day, which is more typical. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Sean. That was awesome.